The windshield wipers of the Lincoln Continental dragged across the glass with a heavy, rubbery thud. Left, right, left, right. The rhythm was the only sound inside the cabin, cutting through the thick layer of silence that had settled over the leather seats. Outside, the Chicago rain hammered down, washing the neon reflections of the diner signs into a blurred, bloody smear on the asphalt. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The stitched leather was cold. My knuckles were pale, the skin pulled tight over the bone. The rear passenger door swung open. A gust of freezing wind rushed in, bringing with it the sharp, metallic scent of wet copper and the heavy aroma of imported Cuban tobacco. The suspension groaned as Don Carmine Rossi sank into the back seat. Vinny slid into the passenger side next to me a second later. The heavy thud of the doors shutting sealed out the storm. The air inside the car instantly turned thick, suffocating. I checked the rearview mirror. Carmine's face was half swallowed by the shadows, but the streetlights passing over the windshield caught the rigid line of his jaw. He was staring at the back of my headrest. His breathing was shallow, rapid. The silver head of his cane dug into the carpeted floorboard. Drive. The command came from Vinny. It was barely a whisper, slipping through his teeth along with the stale stench of black coffee. I eased my foot off the brake. The Lincoln rolled forward, gliding into the wet, black veins of the city. The heater was running on low, blowing warm air over my frozen fingers, but the chill creeping up my spine had nothing to do with the weather. Underneath the cheap fabric of my worn suit jacket, tucked tight against my ribs, the heavy steel of a suppressed mutngin chin, trammuimot, pressed into my flesh. The metal was still faintly warm, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. The acrid smell of burnt cordite seemed to cling to my fingertips, buried deep under my fingernails, defying the harsh industrial soap I had scrubbed them with just 20 minutes ago in a filthy gas station bathroom. Carmine rolled down his window a fraction of an inch. The rain spat through the crack. He flicked a silver lighter. The flame briefly illuminated his hollowed cheeks and the dark, bruised bags under his eyes. He lit a cigar. The thick smoke curled forward, drifting into the front seat. 3 hollow points. That was what it took. 3 brass casings left rolling in the mud behind the abandoned rail yard on Balmybonth Street. Did you see the way his eyes looked, Vinny? Carmine's voice was gravel rolling over broken glass. He didn't wait for an answer. Like a slaughtered pig. They left my boy in the dirt like a slaughtered pig. I kept my eyes on the road. The taillights of a truck ahead bled red onto the wet street. I tapped the brake, letting the Lincoln decelerate smoothly, flawlessly. A good driver never lets the boss feel the momentum shift. A good driver is a ghost, a piece of the furniture, a pair of hands on a wheel, nothing more. Vinny shifted in the passenger seat. The leather creaked. He reached inside his drenched overcoat and pulled out a damp, folded handkerchief, wiping the rain from his bald head. "We will find him, boss." Vinny spoke to the windshield. Whoever did this, they left a trail. The Irish wouldn't move this quiet. The Russians would have made a spectacle. This was close, too quiet. A professional. Carmine exhaled a thick cloud of smoke. I watched his eyes in the mirror. They were dead, flat, staring into nothing. I want the streets turned upside down. I want every rat pulled out of the sewers. I want names. I steered the car around a stalled delivery van, my movements mechanical. My pulse was a steady, slow drumbeat in my ears. I reached down with my right hand and turned the defroster dial up a notch. The movement was slow, deliberate. As my hand dropped back to my lap, my thumb brushed against the side of my trousers. Inside my right pocket, wrapped in a blood-soaked napkin, was a solid gold pinky ring. It was heavy. It bore the Rossi family crest. Until 30 minutes ago, it had been sitting on the finger of Julian Rossi. Turn left on Wabash. Vinny's voice was sharp. I flicked the indicator. The rhythmic clicking joined the sound of the wipers. "Where are we going?" I didn't ask. A driver never asks. I just turned the wheel. "The docks," Vinny muttered, reading Carmine's silence. "We need to see Sal. Sal knows the movement of every piece of iron in this city. If someone bought a clean piece for this hit, Sal sold it. I felt a sudden, microscopic tightening in my chest. The air in the cabin seemed to thin out. Sal, the one loose end. I had bought the Mutngin Chin Tramui Mut from Sal 2 weeks ago. A ghost gun, untraceable, cash only. But Sal had eyes like a hawk and a memory like a steel trap. He remembered faces. He definitely remembered the quiet, pathetic driver who saved up a year's worth of wages to buy a high-end, silenced weapon. I kept my foot steady on the gas. The speedometer needle hovered exactly at the speed limit. The rain picked up, slashing violently across the glass. The docks were a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers, towering cranes, and shadowy warehouses that reeked of salt, dead fish, and diesel fuel. I navigated the narrow, flooded alleys between the towering stacks of steel. The headlights cut through the fog rolling in from the water, illuminating the chain-link fences and the stray dogs scavenging in the trash. "Stop here." Vinny pointed to a warehouse with corrugated iron walls, half-eaten by rust. The massive bay doors were shut. A single yellow bulb flickered above a heavy steel side door. I pulled the Lincoln up to the curb, leaving the engine running. Carmine didn't move immediately. He took one last, long drag of his cigar. The red cherry glowed fiercely in the dark. He crushed it out in the crystal ashtray built into the armrest. "You wait here, Leo." Carmine's voice was devoid of emotion. It was the first time he had acknowledged my existence since getting in the car. I nodded once, staring straight ahead. "Yes, Mr. Rossi." Vinny stepped out first, his hand already resting inside his coat, gripping the butt of his revolver. He opened the umbrella, holding it over Carmine as the old man stepped out into the freezing rain. I watched them in the side mirror. 2 dark figures moving toward the yellow light. Vinny pounded a heavy rhythm on the steel door. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks. The door cracked open, spilling a sliver of pale light onto the wet concrete. They stepped inside. The door slammed shut, plunging the alley back into darkness. I was alone. I exhaled. The breath I had been holding for the last 20 minutes left my lungs in a long, shaky sigh. My hand slipped off the steering wheel. I reached into my pocket, my fingers wrapping around the gold ring. I pulled it out, letting it rest in the palm of my hand. Even in the dim dashboard light, the blood in the crevices of the engraved crest was visibly dark, almost black. Sal. If Sal opened his mouth, Vinny would walk back through that steel door, walk straight up to the driver's side window, and put a bullet through the glass into my temple before I could even shift into drive. I looked at the warehouse. The yellow bulb flickered, buzzing like a dying insect. I reached under my jacket and pulled the Mutngin Chin Tramui Mut. The grip was textured, cold. I checked the chamber. 1 in the pipe. 6 in the magazine. I set the heavy pistol on my lap, covering it with a folded newspaper that had been sitting on the passenger seat. I rolled the driver's side window down just enough to hear the rain and anything else that might come from that building. The engine hummed. The heater hissed. I stared at the door. Every second that ticked by was a drop of acid in my veins. 10 minutes. The door remained shut. My eyes scanned the perimeter. A stray cat darted from under a dumpster, its eyes flashing green in the taillights. A barge sounded its horn out on the water, a low, mournful wail that vibrated in my teeth. I wiped a layer of condensation from the inside of the windshield. 15 minutes. The side door of the warehouse suddenly swung open. I slid my hand under the newspaper, my index finger resting parallel to the trigger guard. I braced my left foot against the floorboard, ready to slam the car in reverse. Vinny stepped out. He was alone. He didn't have the umbrella. He stood under the flickering yellow bulb, the rain plastering his coat to his body. He looked back into the warehouse, nodded, and then turned his gaze toward the Lincoln. He started walking. His steps were heavy, splashing through the puddles. His right hand was tucked deep inside his coat. I watched him approach through the rain-slicked side mirror. His jaw was locked tight. His eyes were focused directly on my windshield, trying to pierce through the darkness of the cabin. The distance closed. 20 feet. 15 feet. I gripped the steering wheel with my left hand. My right hand squeezed the grip of the mutngin chintammuimut under the paper. I watched the muscle in Vinny's neck twitch. He reached the passenger side. He didn't open the door. Instead, he leaned down, tapping the glass with a knuckle. I lowered the window halfway. The cold air hit my face like a wet towel. "Unlock the trunk, Leo." His voice was dead. Flat. I stared at his eyes. I searched for a flicker of recognition, a sign that Sal had pointed the finger, that Vinny knew exactly who was sitting in the driver's seat. There was nothing. Just the cold, vacant stare of a man doing a job. I hit the trunk release button on the console. A dull pop sounded from the rear of the car. Vinny walked to the back. I adjusted the rearview mirror, tilting it down slightly to see the trunk lid rise. Vinny reached into his coat. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a heavy, canvas duffel bag. It was stained dark with grease and water. He heaved it into the trunk. It landed with a sickening, wet thud that made the rear suspension dip. He slammed the trunk shut. The sound echoed in the empty alley. He walked back to the passenger door, ripped it open, and fell into the seat. He smelled like gunpowder and raw meat. He reached forward, turning the heater dial all the way to maximum. His hands were trembling slightly. "Where is Mr. Rossi?" I kept my voice perfectly neutral, the voice of a servant. "He's making a phone call." Vinny stared straight ahead through the windshield, his eyes tracking the hypnotic motion of the wipers. Sal had a loose tongue. My right hand, still hidden under the newspaper, flexed. Did he give a name? Vinny slowly turned his head to look at me. The shadows in the car masked half of his face, making him look like a skull. He stared at me for 3 long seconds. The only sound was the hissing of the heater and the rain drumming on the steel roof. "Yeah," Vinny finally whispered. "Yeah," he gave a name. The newspaper on my lap felt as heavy as a lead vest. My index finger remained perfectly still, resting on the cold steel of the trigger guard. The heater blasted dry, scorching air against my shins, but the sweat on the back of my neck was freezing. Vinny stared at the windshield. The yellow light from the warehouse reflected in his dark, unblinking eyes. He didn't look at me. He just watched the water stream down the glass. "Who?" The word left my mouth flat, hollow, a mechanical inquiry from a mechanical man. Vinny reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. The cellophane wrapper crinkled sharply in the quiet cabin. He tapped a single cigarette out, put it between his lips, and pushed the dashboard lighter in. The mechanism clicked. We waited. 10 seconds, 15 seconds. The lighter popped out with a sharp metallic snap. Vinny pulled it, pressing the glowing orange coil against the tip of the tobacco. He inhaled deeply. The tip flared red, casting a momentary, devilish glow over his sharp cheekbones. "O'Connor," Vinny breathed out with a thick cloud of grey smoke. The Irish, Sal swore on his mother's grave. A red-haired kid from the south side, goes by the name of Tommy, bought the piece 3 days ago, paid double the going rate in small bills. I slowly pulled my hand out from under the newspaper, leaving the Mutnginchin Tram Muimot resting on the leather. I gripped the steering wheel again. My palms were damp, slipping slightly against the stitched seams. Tommy O'Connor. A ghost, a name pulled from the ether, or perhaps a real enforcer for the Irish mob, a poor bastard who just inherited a death sentence. Sal had lied. Sal had looked into the barrel of whatever gun Vinny had shoved into his mouth and spat out the first name that would keep his brains inside his skull. It didn't save him. The heavy thud in the trunk was proof of that. The side door of the warehouse opened again. The yellow bulb flickered, casting a long, distorted shadow across the wet pavement. Carmine stepped out. He moved differently now. The stooped, exhausted posture was gone. He walked with a terrifying rigidity, his cane striking the concrete like a judge's gavel. His black wool coat was soaked, absorbing the rain like a sponge. I hit the unlock button. Carmine pulled the rear door open and slid into the leather seat. The smell hit me instantly. It wasn't just the wet wool and the stale cigar smoke anymore. It was raw, metallic, and incredibly sharp. The unmistakable stench of fresh blood. It clung to his shoes, his cuffs, the bottom hem of his coat. "Take us to the Venetian," Carmine ordered. His voice was no longer a gravelly whisper. It was a low, resonant rumble, echoing from the bottom of a deep well. I put the Lincoln in drive. The tires spun for a fraction of a second on the slick asphalt before finding traction. We rolled away from the docks, leaving the flickering yellow light and the dark warehouse behind. The heavy duffel bag in the trunk shifted slightly as I took the first turn, sliding against the carpet with a muted, sickening scrape. I kept my eyes pinned to the road. The Venetian was a high-end steakhouse in the heart of the Gold Coast, owned through a maze of shell companies by the Rossi family. It was their fortress, their boardroom, their sanctuary. I navigated the heavy Chicago traffic, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the torrential downpour. The silence in the car was absolute, thick enough to choke on. Vinny smoked his cigarette down to the filter, tossing it out the cracked window into the storm. Carmine sat motionless in the back, staring at the blurred lights of the city. I pulled up to the valet stand. The heavy brass doors of the Venetian gleamed under the awning. A young valet in a red jacket rushed forward, popping an umbrella open. I threw the car into park and stepped out into the freezing downpour. I walked around the rear, my eyes briefly lingering on the trunk lid, before opening Carmine's door. He stepped out, ignoring the umbrella, letting the rain wash over his face. Vinny was right behind him. "Park it out back," Vinny commanded, not looking at me. "Keep the engine warm." I slid back into the driver's seat. The smell of copper still lingered in the back. I drove around the block, turning into the narrow, brick-paved alley behind the restaurant. The service entrance was a heavy steel door, monitored by 2 cameras mounted high on the brick wall. I backed the Lincoln into a shadowed alcove next to the dumpsters, putting the transmission in park, but leaving the engine idling. The exhaust plumed into the cold night air like white smoke. I turned off the headlights. The alley plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, greasy glow of a street lamp down the block. I reached over, folded the newspaper, and tucked the Mukngin Chintram Muimot back into the holster concealed beneath my left armpit. The heavy steel pressed reassuringly against my ribs. I turned off the heater. The cold began to seep back through the glass almost immediately. I sat in the dark for an hour. The rhythmic thumping of the rain on the roof was the only sound. My mind replayed the last 72 hours. The dead drop at Union Station. Locker, Borntram Lair High. The manila envelope packed with non-sequential $100 bills. The photograph of Julian Rossi. The handwritten note indicating his exact location at the Rayliard. I had never spoken to the client. I had never heard their voice. The underworld was a machine, and I was just a cog, a silent tool utilized by invisible hands. I had assumed it was the Russians or the Irish. They had been pushing into Rossi territory for 6 months. Julian was a liability, a reckless, drug-addicted hare who ran his mouth and bled money. Taking him out was a strategic strike. But Tommy O'Connor, Sal pointing the finger at the Irish. It made too much sense. It was clean. It was logical. It was the perfect narrative to start a war. The heavy steel door of the service entrance clicked open. The sound cut through the rain like a gunshot. I stiffened, my hand drifting instinctively toward my lapel. A figure stepped out into the alley. It wasn't Carmine or Vinny. It was a man in a chef's apron, holding a black garbage bag. He tossed it into the dumpster, the wet trash slapping against the metal sides. He stood under the narrow awning, fishing a crushed pack of cigarettes from his pocket. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the harsh lines of his face. It was Paulie, one of the kitchen staff, a guy who occasionally ran numbers for the lower-level capos. He took a drag, his eyes scanning the alley. He spotted the Lincoln idling in the shadows. He didn't wave. He just stared for a moment, then walked slowly toward the car. I didn't roll down the window. I watched him approach through the water-streaked glass. He tapped the window twice with his knuckles. I rolled it down an inch. The smell of roasted garlic, frying oil, and stale tobacco drifted in. "Vinny wants you inside," Paulie muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Coat check room. He says you're making him nervous sitting out here like a sitting duck." I stared at him. A driver never goes inside during a sit-down. A driver stays with the car, Always. Are you deaf, Leo? Paulie flicked his cigarette onto the wet bricks. They're locking the place down. Nobody stays on the street. Move your ass. He turned and walked back to the steel door. I sat frozen for 3 seconds. The rhythm of the rain felt heavier. I killed the engine. The silence inside the cabin was sudden and deafening. I pulled the keys from the ignition, dropping them into my right pocket next to the gold pinky ring. I stepped out of the car, locking the doors behind me. The alley was freezing. The wind whipped the rain into my face as I walked toward the service door. Paulie held it open, his eyes darting up and down the street. I stepped inside. The transition was jarring. The air was thick, suffocatingly hot, saturated with the rich, heavy aromas of simmering marinara, roasting veal, and expensive red wine. The kitchen was a chaotic blur of white jackets, clattering stainless steel pans, and shouting voices. Nobody looked at me. I was a ghost moving through their purgatory. I pushed through the swinging double doors into the main dining room. The contrast was absolute. The lighting was low, casting everything in deep amber and bruised velvet. The heavy crystal chandeliers were dimmed to a faint glow. The restaurant was completely empty of regular patrons. The chairs were stacked on the tables in the outer sections. In the center of the room, seated around a massive circular oak table, were the capos, 5 men, the heavy hitters of the Rossi family. Fat Tony Salerno, his massive frame spilling over the sides of his chair, a half-eaten plate of linguine pushed aside. Jimmy the Shiv, his sharp, rat-like face illuminated by the table lamp, continuously shuffling a deck of cards. Old Man Russo, wheezing softly through an oxygen tube hooked over his ears, and at the head of the table, Don Carmine. Vinny stood right behind him, a permanent, silent sentinel. I stayed in the shadows, moving soundlessly along the dark velvet walls toward the coat check room near the front entrance. The thick Persian carpet swallowed the sound of my footsteps. I slipped behind the heavy mahogany counter of the coat check. The space was tight, smelling strongly of wet wool, cedar wood, and expensive leather. Hundreds of coats hung on the brass racks, a forest of dark fabrics. I stood completely still in the dark corner. From here, I had a clear line of sight to the central table through a narrow gap between a heavy winter overcoat and a cashmere scarf. I could hear their voices, muffled but distinct. "We hit them tonight," Jimmy the Shiv was saying, his voice a tight, coiled spring. The cards snapped rapidly in his hands. "We don't wait for a sit-down. We don't ask the commission for permission. They took Julian. We take O'Connor, and we take his boss. We burn the Irish out of the south side." Fat Tony grunted, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "It's a big move, Jimmy. The commission won't like it. Moving without absolute proof." "Sal was proof," Vinny cut in. His voice was flat, slicing through the tension like a razor. "Sal sold the ghost gun to O'Connor. Sal is dead. O'Connor is the trigger. The Irish are the hand. There is nothing to discuss." I watched Carmine. He sat perfectly still, staring at a crystal glass of amber liquid on the table. He hadn't touched it. His face was a mask of carved stone. The trembling in his hands had stopped. He looked like a man who had already crossed over to the other side. "Do it," Carmine whispered. The 2 words sealed the fate of dozens of men. The table fell dead silent. Jimmy stopped shuffling the cards. Fat Tony slowly nodded. The machinery of war had been switched on. The false trail had become reality. The blood that would flow tonight would wash away any inconsistencies. I leaned back against the wall of the coat check room, the cedar wood pressed against my spine. I breathed in slowly through my nose, exhaling through my mouth. The plan was flawless. Vinny had orchestrated a masterpiece. He had given them a target, an enemy to focus their grief and rage upon. A sharp, metallic, clinking sound broke my concentration. I looked up. Vinny had moved away from the table. He was walking toward the front of the restaurant, heading straight for the coat check room. My heart stalled in my chest. I shrank back into the deepest corner, pressing myself against the wall, merging with the shadows. I pulled my arms tight to my sides. I controlled my breathing, making it shallow, completely silent. Vinny stepped behind the mahogany counter. He was less than 3 feet away from me. I could smell the stale smoke on his clothes, the faint odor of peppermint gum, and the lingering, raw smell of the docks. He didn't look in my direction. He reached for a heavy, dark grey trench coat hanging on the rack nearest to the door. It was his coat. He patted the pockets. He pulled out a pair of black leather gloves. He shoved them into his trouser pockets. Then, his hand slipped into the deep, inside breast pocket of the coat. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The ambient light from the dining room caught the edge of the paper. My eyes locked onto it. It was identical to the envelope I had pulled from locker Borntramlair High at Union Station. Same size. Same faded, yellowish tint. But what made the blood freeze in my veins was the stamp in the top right corner. It was a small, smudged, purple ink stamp. An eagle clutching an anchor. The logo of the First Oceanic Bank, a defunct bank that had closed its doors 5 years ago. The Rossi family used their old, abandoned vaults to store illicit cash. The envelope I had received, the envelope that paid for Julian's life, had that exact same smudged purple stamp. Vinny held the envelope for a second. He opened the flap, peering inside. I caught a glimpse of the green banded stacks. Hundreds. He nodded to himself, a microscopic tightening of his lips, a phantom smile. He tucked the envelope under his arm, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the cloakroom. I stood paralyzed in the dark. The smell of cedar and wet wool suddenly made me nauseous. The velvet walls seemed to close in on me. Tommy O'Connor didn't pull the trigger. The Irish didn't order the hit. Vinny did. Vinny had used family money to pay a ghost to kill the boss's son. He was cleaning house. He was removing the unstable hair to clear his own path to the throne. And he was using the grief to launch a war that would wipe out their biggest rivals. 2 birds with 1 bullet, and I was the bullet. The heat in the restaurant became unbearable. The sweat rolled down my ribs, stinging my skin. If Vinny had paid for the hit, he knew exactly how the money was delivered. He knew the dead drop. He knew the protocol. He might not know my face. He might not know the driver was the shooter, but he knew there was a loose end out there. Sal was dead. The Irish were about to be slaughtered. I was the only thing left connecting Vinny to the murder of Julian Rossi. I heard footsteps approaching again. Fast, heavy, Leo. It was Paulie. He stood at the entrance of the cloakroom, wiping his greasy hands on his apron. His eyes were wide, darting nervously toward the main room. Vinny wants the car at the front. Now. They're moving out. I stepped out of the shadows. My face was completely blank. I didn't say a word. I walked past Paulie, out the front doors, back into the freezing, slashing rain. I walked down the alley. I unlocked the Lincoln. I slid into the driver's seat. I put the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. The wipers dragged across the glass. Left, right, left, right. The tires tore through the standing water on the asphalt, with a sound like ripping silk. The Lincoln was a heavy vault of steel and glass, gliding south on Michigan Avenue, away from the glittering gold of the high-rises, and down into the rotting concrete teeth of the south side. The heater was still blowing, but the air felt thin, devoid of oxygen. I stared at the red taillights of a city bus 3 blocks ahead. My hands were clamped onto the steering wheel. The leather was slick with the cold sweat leaking from my palms. Vinny sat in the passenger seat. Carmine was a silent shadow in the back. Turn off the main avenue. Vinny spoke to the windshield. Take the access road past the rail yards. I flicked the indicator. The rhythmic clicking of the relay sounded like a time bomb under the dashboard. I eased the heavy steering wheel to the right. The tires thumped over the uneven, brick-paved surface of the industrial district. The streetlights here were dead or smashed. The only illumination came from the Lincoln's headlights, cutting twin cones of white into the driving rain. The perspective had flipped. The world inside this car had inverted in the span of 60 seconds back at the Venetian. Every breath Vinny took, every subtle shift of his weight in the leather seat, amplified the deafening roar of the truth in my skull. He wasn't the loyal enforcer, he was the architect. The manila envelope with the purple stamp was a ghost hovering in the space between us. He had paid me. He had bought the bullets that ripped through Julian Rossi, and now he was sitting 2 feet away, chewing peppermint gum, directing the grieving father toward a slaughter. "Slow down," Vinny ordered. I eased my foot off the accelerator. The heavy car coasted. The rain drummed a frantic, chaotic beat on the roof. "We are too exposed here," Carmine's voice rumbled from the darkness behind me. It sounded weak, hollowed out by the cold and the blood drying on his coat. "This is O'Connor's backyard. We should have brought the trailing cars. We need to hit the safe house quiet, boss," Vinny said. His tone was perfectly measured, soothing but firm. "Jimmy and Tony are moving on the club. We take the head of the snake right here. We park under the overpass. We walk the last block. They won't hear us over the storm." My eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Carmine was staring at the back of Vinny's headrest. The old man nodded once, a slow, tired movement. I looked at the road ahead. The rusted steel beams of the L train overpass loomed out of the darkness like the ribcage of a giant, decaying beast. It was a black hole. No lights, no cross streets. Just a narrow tunnel of brick and iron, flanked by abandoned warehouses with boarded-up windows. A perfect choke point. A kill box. Vinny reached into his coat. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a fresh stick of gum, unwrapped it, and popped it into his mouth. The sharp scent of peppermint hit the heater vent and circulated through the cabin, masking the smell of Carmine's blood. "Pull in there." Between the concrete pillars, Vinny pointed a thick finger at a pitch-black alcove beneath the tracks. I turned the wheel. The headlights swept across the wet concrete, illuminating a mountain of discarded tires and a stripped-down sedan resting on cinder blocks. The Lincoln rolled into the deep shadow. The rain was cut off instantly as the heavy concrete bridge shielded us. The drumming on the roof stopped. The silence that rushed in was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. "Kill the engine." Vinny's hand dropped to his lap. I turned the key. The dashboard lights died. The engine shuddered and went quiet. The only sound left was the ticking of the cooling exhaust pipe and the distant, muffled roar of the storm outside the overpass. Vinny grabbed the handle of his door. "I will scout the perimeter. Make sure the alley is clear to the safe house. Boss, stay in the car. Keep your head down." Vinny pushed the door open. The freezing air rushed in. He stepped out onto the damp concrete. He shut the door with a soft, controlled click. He didn't look back. I watched his silhouette merge with the shadows, moving toward the far end of the tunnel, his heavy trench coat swallowing the faint light from the street beyond. I sat frozen in the driver's seat. My right hand moved instinctively, inching toward my left armpit, where the Mutngin Cham Muimot rested. The cold steel felt like a block of ice against my ribs. Vinny was gone. He had left the boss alone in a blacked-out car in hostile territory. The protocol was wrong. The logic was broken. An enforcer never leaves the Don unguarded in a blind spot, unless the blind spot is a grave. Something moved in the peripheral vision of the passenger side mirror. A shadow detaching itself from the rusted hull of the stripped sedan. Then another. My jaw locked. My teeth ground together so hard I tasted copper. "Lock the doors," Carmine commanded from the back. His voice was suddenly sharp, the fatigue stripped away. I slammed the palm of my hand onto the master lock switch. All 4 doors clacked shut simultaneously. 2 sets of headlights flared to life at the entrance of the tunnel, blindingly bright, high beams. They cut through the darkness, pinning the Lincoln like a bug on a slide. The glare washed out my vision, turning the windshield into a wall of solid white light. "They're not Irish," I whispered. The words tasted like ash. A heavy, flat-nosed truck blocked the front exit. In the rearview mirror, the reverse lights of another vehicle illuminated the brick wall behind us. We were boxed. Figures stepped out from behind the blinding headlights. 4 men, heavy coats. They moved with the synchronized, deliberate pace of professional exterminators. The light caught the long, blue-steeled barrels of pump-action shotguns. Vinny set us up. Carmine's voice was a dead, flat hiss. The realization wasn't a shock. It was a confirmation of a cancer he already knew was spreading. "Get down." I didn't yell. The command ripped from my throat as a primal growl. I grabbed the gear shift, ignoring the brake. I slammed the transmission into reverse. The engine wasn't running. I twisted the key with my left hand, while my right hand tore the Mutngin Chin Tram Mui Mot from the shoulder holster. The starter motor whined, a high-pitched scream that felt like it lasted a lifetime. The first shotgun blast shattered the quiet. The front passenger window exploded inward. A hurricane of tempered glass shards swept through the cabin. A jagged piece sliced across my right cheek. The heavy lead slugs tore through the leather headrest where Vinny's head had been 10 seconds ago, burying themselves deep into the rear seat cushion, inches from Carmine's chest. The Lincoln's engine roared. I stomped the accelerator to the floor. The massive TARM engine screamed. The rear tires spun violently on the wet concrete, filling the tunnel with the acrid stench of burning rubber, before finally biting down. The heavy car launched backward. The trunk smashed into the vehicle, blocking our rear. The impact was a colossal, bone-jarring crunch of collapsing steel and shattering plastic. My head snapped back against the headrest. The steering wheel jerked violently in my grip. More gunfire erupted. Deafening, chaotic barrage. The windshield starred, a dozen spider webs of cracked glass appearing in a fraction of a second. A bullet punched through the dashboard, spraying plastic shrapnel into my right arm. The smell of gunpowder and atomized engine coolant flooded the cabin. I shifted into drive. The transmission shrieked in protest. 2 men were standing directly in front of the Lincoln, racking their shotguns. I didn't reach for the brake. I leveled the Mutngin Chin Tram Mui Mot over the steering wheel, aiming through the shattered passenger window. I squeezed the trigger. The heavy weapon bucked in my hand. Once, twice. The suppressor hissed, a sharp spitting sound over the roar of the engine. The brass casings ejected, bouncing off the roof and burning against my neck. The man on the right crumpled, a dark hole appearing in his throat. He dropped the shotgun, his hands flying up to catch the blood pumping into the air. The Lincoln surged forward. The heavy chrome bumper caught the second man squarely in the hips. The sickening, wet thud of bone snapping vibrated up the steering column. He rolled over the hood, his face smashing against the starred windshield, smearing a thick streak of crimson across the glass before tumbling off into the darkness. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, aiming the heavy car at the narrow gap between the blocking truck and the concrete pillar. The metal scraped against the pillar, shrieking a high-pitched wail as the passenger side of the Lincoln was crushed inward. Sparks flew in a brilliant, blinding shower, illuminating the tunnel for a split second. We tore out of the underpass. The freezing rain hit the shattered windows, whipping through the cabin like a barrage of icy needles. The wind roared, deafening, drowning out the sound of the engine. The Lincoln was limping, the alignment destroyed, the suspension pulling violently to the right. I kept the accelerator pinned. We flew down the slick, empty streets of the industrial sector. The streetlights overhead were a blurred, frantic strobing of yellow. I didn't check the rear-view mirror. I just kept my foot buried, weaving erratically to make a harder target. My right hand was still gripping the Mutngin Chin Tram Mui Mot. My knuckles were white. The barrel was hot. Blood dripped steadily from the cut on my cheek, running down my jaw and soaking into my cheap collar. It was warm. It felt sticky. I dragged a ragged breath into my lungs. The air smelled of rain, raw fuel and burnt cordite. Turn right on Bourne Mui Baith. Carmine's voice came from the floorboards. It was weak, strained, but absolutely devoid of panic. I twisted the wheel. The car skidded through the intersection, the rear end kicking out wildly before I corrected the slide. "Are you hit?" I kept my eyes on the road. The windshield was a mosaic of shattered glass, barely holding together. "No." Carmine slowly pulled himself up onto the rear seat. The wind tore at his thinning grey hair. The interior light flickered, casting erratic, ghostly shadows across his face. He looked at the ruined interior, the bullet holes punching through the leather, the blood smeared across the dashboard. He didn't look at me like a driver anymore. His cold, dark eyes locked onto the silenced pistol in my right hand. "Sal didn't sell that gun to the Irish," Carmine stated. "It wasn't a question." I kept my foot on the gas. The speedometer hovered at 80. The car rattled like a tin can full of rocks. "No, Mr. Rossi." He didn't. I slid the 1911 onto my lap. "Vinny," Carmine whispered. The name was a curse. Yes. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. The wind howled through the broken windows. Carmine leaned back against the shredded leather. He pulled his coat tighter around himself. The king had just realized his castle was built on a bed of vipers, and the man holding the wheel was a killer who didn't belong to his court. "Where are we going?" I asked. My voice was a rasp, my throat completely dry. Carmine stared out the broken window at the passing shadows. The empire he built was burning down around him, lit by a match his right hand had struck. "We go to the slaughterhouse," Carmine said, turning his gaze to the back of my head. "We don't run. We go back to the Venetian. We kill them all." The engine block of the Lincoln knocked with a heavy, sickening rhythm, metal grinding on metal. The temperature gauge on the dashboard was pinned to the far right, the needle buried in the red zone. Sweet, noxious fumes of boiling antifreeze leaked through the air vents, mixing with the sharp scent of burnt ozone and the copper tang of the blood drying on my jaw. The steering wheel violently pulled to the right, forcing my left bicep to cramp as I fought to keep the heavy frame moving in a straight line. The shattered windshield let the freezing Chicago wind howl through the cabin, stripping away any remaining heat. We crawled back toward the Gold Coast like a wounded animal seeking its own den. I bypassed the main thoroughfares, keeping the ruined car submerged in the darkest, narrowest alleys I could find. The shadows offered a fragile cloak. Every time headlights swept across the brick walls ahead, my thumb brushed the safety of the 1911 resting on my thigh. "Pull into the loading dock on Erie," Carmine rasped from the back seat. I checked the mirror. He was hunched over, wrapping a torn strip of his expensive silk tie around a deep laceration on his left palm. The blood soaked through the fabric instantly, turning it black in the dim light. He tied the knot with his teeth. He didn't wince. The loading dock on Erie Street was a blind alley serving a row of commercial textile buildings, sharing a rear basement wall with the Venetian. I nursed the dying Lincoln down the narrow incline, the ruined suspension scraping against the concrete with a high-pitched squeal. I cut the ignition. The engine choked, shuddered violently, and died in a hiss of escaping steam. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic pinging of the cooling exhaust and the relentless drum of the rain. I stepped out. The puddles soaked through my leather shoes immediately. I opened the rear door. Carmine emerged slowly. His movements were stiff, his joints locking up from the cold, but his posture was terrifyingly straight. He leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane, the metal tip scraping against the wet concrete. He moved toward a rusted steel door set deep into the brick foundation of the textile building. There was no handle, just a heavy, grease-covered keypad mounted flush against the wall. He punched in a 4-digit code with his bloody hand. The heavy deadbolt retracted with a solid, echoing clack. He pushed the door open. A wave of stale, frozen air washed over us, smelling faintly of freon and rot. The Prohibition tunnels, a forgotten maze beneath the city's crust. "Follow the pipes." Carmine stepped into the darkness. I grabbed a heavy maglite from the trunk of the Lincoln and followed, pulling the heavy steel door shut behind us. The darkness was absolute. I flicked the flashlight on, keeping the beam pointed at the muddy ground. The tunnel was narrow, the brick walls covered in a thick layer of black mold. Thick, cast-iron pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping condensation onto the back of my neck. The air grew colder with every step. My breath plumed into thick white clouds in the flashlight beam. We walked for 10 minutes. The only sound was the hollow tap of Carmine's cane and the squelch of my wet shoes in the mud. The 1911 was gripped tight in my right hand, the metal barrel freezing against my bare knuckles. The tunnel dead-ended at a heavy, reinforced steel door covered in a layer of white frost. "The meat lockers," Carmine whispered. His breath hit the freezing air. "Vinny won't have guards down here. He thinks I am rotting under the L-train overpass." Carmine reached into his coat and produced a heavy brass key. He inserted it into the frosted lock, using both hands to turn it. The mechanism ground. I grabbed the heavy latch, pulling down with all my weight. The door broke the ice seal with a loud, tearing crack. We stepped inside. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees. The massive subterranean freezer was filled with rows of suspended steel hooks. Massive sides of dry-aged beef hung from the ceiling rails, casting monstrous, deformed shadows in the beam of my flashlight. The smell was overpowering. Raw, iron-rich blood, aging fat, and the biting chemical scent of the cooling units. The heavy motors hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth. I turned off the flashlight. We navigated by the faint, blue emergency lights glowing at the far end of the locker. We moved through the forest of dead flesh. The frozen carcasses brushed against my shoulders, as hard as concrete. I noticed a shift in the air. A faint line of yellow light appeared beneath a heavy, rubber-flapped door at the end of the aisle. The service stairs leading up to the kitchen. Carmine stopped. He leaned heavily on his cane, taking slow, deep breaths. He looked at me. The blue emergency light caught the hollows of his cheeks. "How many rounds?" he asked. 7, I replied. "Make them count." I pushed through the heavy rubber flaps. We were at the bottom of a narrow, concrete stairwell. The heat radiating from the top was instant, carrying the smell of roasting garlic and charred meat. The kitchen was still operational, still cooking for a ghost ship. I went first. I climbed the stairs with absolute silence, placing the ball of my foot on the edge of each concrete step, letting my weight settle slowly before lifting the other leg. The mut was raised. My eye aligned with the sights. I reached the top landing. The heavy steel door leading to the kitchen was cracked open an inch. I pressed my eye to the gap. The kitchen was empty. The stoves were still burning low, pots of marinara bubbling slowly, but the cooks were gone, cleared out. The swinging doors leading to the main dining room were closed. I pushed the door open. Carmine followed, his cane making a soft, muted thud on the linoleum tiles. We moved through the stainless steel maze of prep tables and fryers. The heat was suffocating after the freezer. Sweat instantly broke out on my forehead, stinging the cut on my cheek. We reached the swinging double doors. The porthole windows were covered in a layer of grease, but I could see the glow of the dining room chandeliers. I could hear the voices. "It's done," Jimmy the Shiv was saying. His voice was a tight, vibrating wire. The scanners picked up the police chatter. 3 bodies under the overpass. The Lincoln is gone, but the truck driver swore he saw the old man take a slug to the chest before the car bolted. A heavy, wet thud sounded. Fat Tony slamming his fist on the oak table. "We are bleeding," Tony growled. "Julian yesterday. The boss tonight. The Irish are tearing us apart. We need to strike the docks. We burn O'Connor's warehouse to the ground." There was a long stretch of silence. I listened to the faint, rhythmic clinking of ice against crystal. "We strike." Vinny's voice drifted through the door. It was perfectly calm, smooth. The voice of a priest delivering a eulogy. "But we do not strike blind. We do not panic. We consolidate." I pressed my back against the wall next to the door. Carmine stood opposite me. He stared at the grease-covered porthole. The muscle in his jaw was jumping. The veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. "Carmine was a good man," Vinny continued, his tone lowering, vibrating with fabricated respect. "But he was blinded by his son's blood. He rushed into an ambush. He let grief make his tactical decisions. We cannot make the same mistake. The commission will demand order. They will look to this table." "He is claiming the chair," Jimmy muttered. "No," Vinny corrected softly. "I am holding the structure together. The Rossi family does not collapse because the head is severed. The body adapts. Tomorrow, we meet with the New York representatives. We present a unified front. We tell them the Irish have broken the treaty, and we ask for their blessing to wipe the South Side clean." Vinny was spinning the web, a masterpiece of manipulation. He had eliminated the erratic son, lured the boss into an execution, and now he was presenting himself as the calm, rational savior to the capos. And tomorrow he would use the combined weight of the commission to annihilate the Irish, solidifying his absolute control. "Are we sure the driver didn't get him out?" Old man Russo wheezed. The oxygen tank hissed. The driver is a nobody. A steering wheel attendant. Vinny dismissed the thought instantly. The hit squad was professional. If the old man survived the initial volley, he will bleed out in that wrecked car before morning. The streets are flooded. He has nowhere to go. Carmine slowly raised his right hand. He placed his bloody palm flat against the swinging door. He looked at me. His eyes were completely hollowed out, two black pits of pure, absolute zero. He gave a microscopic nod. I stepped back, gripping the Mutnginchintam Moimot with both hands, lowering the barrel to a low-ready position. Carmine pushed the doors. The heavy wood swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. The transition from the bright, chaotic kitchen into the dim, amber-lit dining room was disorienting. The heavy crystal chandeliers cast long, distorted shadows across the thick velvet carpet. The 5 men at the table froze. Fat Tony had a fork halfway to his mouth. Jimmy the Shiv's hand hovered over the deck of cards. Old man Russo stopped breathing, the oxygen machine hissing loudly in the sudden vacuum of silence. Vinny was sitting at the head of the table, in Carmine's chair. He had a glass of scotch in his hand. He didn't drop it. He didn't gasp. His eyes simply widened a fraction of a millimeter. The ice in his glass clinked softly as his grip tightened. Carmine walked into the room. He dragged his right leg slightly, the cane biting deep into the thick carpet. His black coat was shredded, heavily stained with dark, drying blood. He smelled like a slaughterhouse. He moved with a slow, terrifying deliberation, stopping 10 feet from the head of the table. Nobody moved. The air in the room felt like solid lead. I stepped out from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, moving silently along the dark wall. I kept my back to the heavy velvet drapes. I raised the Mutnginchintam Moimot. The dark circle of the suppressor pointed directly at the side of Vinny's head. Carmine stared at Vinny. Vinny stared back. "You're in my chair, Vincenzo," Carmine whispered. The voice was barely a rasp, stripped of all its volume, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. Vinny, slowly, very slowly, placed the crystal glass on the table. He didn't reach for his coat. He didn't look. It was the other Capos. He kept his eyes locked on the old man. "Boss," Vinny said. His voice was steady. Too steady. "We received a report. The police scanner. They said you paid 4 shooters with pump actions to butcher me in a blind alley." Carmine interrupted. The table erupted. Jimmy the Shiv pushed his chair back, his hand diving under his jacket. Fat Tony tried to stand, his massive bulk knocking the table. I shifted my aim. I placed the front sight post of the Mutnginchintam Moimot squarely on the center of Jimmy the Shiv's chest. "Don't." My voice was dead. A mechanical crackle in the tense air. Jimmy froze. He looked at me. He looked at the suppressed weapon in my hand. His hand slowly slipped out from under his jacket, empty. Fat Tony sank back into his chair, breathing heavily. Vinny didn't look at me. He didn't even acknowledge the gun pointed at his skull. He kept his eyes on Carmine. The calculation behind his dark pupils was running at light speed. The Chinmuchinfantram truth was sitting in the middle of the table, stinking of betrayal and cordite. The false flag, the ambush, the usurpation. "It was a setup, boss," Vinny said, his voice dropping to a low, persuasive hum. "The Irish knew our route. They bought a rat in the police precinct. They set the trap. I came back here to rally the men, to form a counterattack." Carmine took 1 step forward. He reached into his blood-soaked coat with his uninjured hand. He pulled out the folded, damp newspaper I had used to cover my gun in the car. He let it drop onto the table. Then he reached into his pocket again. He pulled out the gold pinky ring, Julian's ring. He tossed it. The heavy gold clattered onto the oak table, spinning, the blood crusting the family crest, catching the light. "Sal didn't give you a name, Vincenzo." Carmine's voice was dropping lower, sinking into a cold, terrifying abyss. "Because Sal didn't sell the gun to the Irish. He sold it to you. You bought the ghost gun. You hired the shooter. You slaughtered my blood, and you used the grief to hand me over to the butchers." Vinny stared at the ring. The muscle in his jaw twitched. A single rapid spasm, The armor was cracking. "Boss, you are bleeding. You are not thinking straight." Vinny's hands remained flat on the table. "You are looking at the man who has protected your back for 15 years. Why would I touch Julian? Because Julian was a liability," Carmine hissed, stepping closer. "Because Julian was going to inherit the empire, and you refused to kneel to an addict. So you cut the infected limb off, and you tried to cut the head off to take the crown." Vinny's eyes finally flicked toward me, just a microscopic glance. He looked at the Mutngin Chin Tram Mui Mot in my hand. He looked at the matte black finish, the custom suppressor, the missing link. The entire room hung suspended on a wire thinner than a human hair. Vinny had orchestrated the hit. He had used family money in the manila envelope with the purple bank stamp. He had set the dead drop at Union Station. He knew the parameters of the contract. He knew the weapon he requested, a suppressed Mutngin Chin Tram Mui Mot. Vinny's eyes snapped back to my face. The absolute, chilling realization washed over his features. The micro-expression lasted less than 1/10 of a second, but it was deafening. The slight widening of the nostrils, the sudden, rigid stillness of his chest. He didn't just recognize the type of gun, he recognized the irony. The man standing in the shadows holding the gun to his head wasn't just the driver who had miraculously saved the boss. I was the ghost. I was the shooter he hired. He had put the bullet in the chamber, and now that same bullet was aimed at his skull. I stared back at him. My face was a mask of carved stone. My breathing was shallow, completely silent. I felt the sweat trace a cold path down my spine. If Vinny spoke, if he pointed at me and revealed the truth to Carmine right now, Carmine would kill us both. The boss was a wounded animal. He would burn the entire room down to exact his revenge. Vinny opened his mouth. His lips parted. The air shifted. Vinny opened his mouth. His lips parted. A single drop of condensation detached itself from the heavy crystal glass on the table and hit the polished oak with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil. He looked at me. It was a microscopic shift of his pupils, a silent, desperate transmission sent across the dimly lit room. In that fraction of a second, the entire architecture of the Chicago underworld was laid bare between us. Vinny knew. He saw the exact make of the suppressor, the customized matte finish of the barrel, the dead, unblinking void in my eyes. He realized the fatal flaw in his masterpiece. He had hired a ghost, assuming the ghost would vanish into the ether. He never calculated that the ghost was the man holding the steering wheel of the boss's car. If he spoke my name, if he screamed the truth to the room, he would sign his own death warrant. Confessing my identity meant confessing he hired me. He was trapped in a cage built of his own flawless logic. His eyes darted back to Carmine. The old man was a statue of bleeding marble, his hand resting near the gold pinky ring on the table. Vinny's right shoulder dropped, a shift so slight it was almost an illusion, a shift down toward the heavy bulge beneath his left lapel. The instinct of a cornered animal choosing the fire over the trap. I did not blink. I did not breathe. I simply applied 3 pounds of pressure to the curved steel trigger of the Mutngin Chin Tram Mui Mot. The weapon bucked in my hand. The suppressor hissed a sharp, violent spit that sounded like a tire rupturing on hot asphalt. The brass casing ejected upward, catching the light of the crystal chandelier, a spinning spark of gold before it hit the thick Persian carpet. The heavy, Bun Mulam caliber hollow point caught Vinny directly in the bridge of his nose. The kinetic energy snapped his head back with brutal mechanical efficiency. The back of his skull exploded outward. A horrific spray of crimson, bone fragments, and grey matter painted the velvet wallpaper behind him. His body seized, rigid as a steel beam for 1 second before the strings were cut. He slumped forward, his face smashed into the oak table. The heavy crystal glass tipped over, the expensive amber scotch spilling across the wood, mixing instantly with the thick, dark pool expanding rapidly from beneath his shattered skull. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Jimmy the Shiv was frozen, a playing card halfway raised in his hand. Fat Tony's mouth hung open, a wheezing sound stuck in his throat. Old man Russo's oxygen machine hissed loudly, a rhythmic mechanical breath in a room full of dead men. The smell hit the air. It was a suffocating cocktail. The rich, peaty aroma of the spilled scotch, the harsh, metallic tang of fresh blood, and the sharp, acrid sting of burnt cordite drifting from the barrel of my gun. Carmine did not flinch. He did not step back from the expanding pool of blood dripping off the edge of the table onto his expensive leather shoes. He simply stared down at the ruined back of Vinny's head. Slowly, the old man reached out. His hand was trembling again, the adrenaline leaving his system, replaced by the freezing reality of his kingdom. He picked up the gold pinky ring from the table, wiping the fresh blood off on the lapel of Vinny's coat. He slipped the ring into his pocket. Carmine turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were ancient. The fire of vengeance had burned out, leaving nothing but grey, cold ash. He looked at the smoking gun in my hand. He looked at the blood drying on my cheek, the ruined suit, the steady, unmoving posture. I kept the gun raised, the barrel still pointed at the space where Vinny's head had been, my finger resting parallel to the trigger guard. "Lower it, Leo." Carmine's voice was a whisper, fragile as dry leaves. I lowered the weapon, holding it flush against my thigh. Carmine turned back to the table. He looked at the 3 remaining capos. They were completely paralyzed, their eyes darting between the corpse on the table, the old man, and the driver holding the gun. "Vincenzo was a traitor," Carmine announced. The words were heavy, dropping onto the table like lead weights. "He orchestrated the murder of my blood. He ordered the hit on the street. He tried to take the chair. The chair is not empty." Jimmy the Shiv slowly lowered his playing card. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms down. Fat Tony nodded, his chins trembling. "Yes, boss," Jimmy whispered. His voice cracked. "Clean this up," Carmine ordered. He did not wait for a response. He turned his back on the table, leaning his weight onto his silver-tipped cane, and began the long, slow walk toward the front doors of the restaurant. I followed. I walked 3 paces behind him, a shadow detached from the wall. My shoes made no sound on the carpet. I kept the Mutngin Chintram Muimat in my hand until we reached the coat check room, sliding it back into the shoulder holster beneath my ruined jacket. The heat of the barrel seeped through my shirt, burning my ribs. We stepped out into the Chicago night. The storm had broken. The rain had stopped, leaving the city air sharp, freezing, and clean. The neon signs reflected in the deep puddles on the asphalt. The valet stand was empty. A black town car sat idling at the curb, left by one of the capos. I walked past Carmine, opening the rear passenger door. He stopped. He looked at the leather seat. He looked at the city skyline. Then he looked at me. "You saved my life tonight, Leo." His voice was hollow. The gratitude was a mechanical transaction. "I am a driver, Mr. Rossi," I said. My voice was perfectly flat, a blank slate. Carmine stared at my face. He was looking for something, a glimmer of ambition, a flicker of fear. He found nothing. I gave him nothing. I was an empty vessel, a tool that had performed its function flawlessly. "You are not a driver anymore," Carmine whispered. He climbed into the back seat. I shut the door. The heavy thud echoed in the empty street. I walked around to the driver's side. I pulled the handle, sliding into the cold leather seat. The smell of the new car was sterile, lacking the copper scent of the Lincoln. I put my hands on the wheel at 10 and 2. The steering wheel was wrapped in pristine leather. I looked in the rearview mirror. Carmine was a shadow, leaning his head back against the glass, his eyes closed. He was the king of a graveyard, entirely dependent on the man who had dug the graves. I shifted the car into drive. We rolled forward, gliding silently over the wet streets. The heater blew warm air over my frozen knuckles. I felt the weight of the manila envelope sitting in my locker at the train station. I felt the weight of the Mutngin Chin Tramway Mot against my ribs. I felt the invisible blood of Julian Rossi permanently stained on my hands. Vinny had died believing he was the grand architect, outsmarted by a random twist of fate. Carmine would live the rest of his days believing he had purged the poison from his family, protected by a fiercely loyal hound. Neither of them knew the truth. The underworld is a machine built on illusions. Power is not a throne. Power is not a gun. Power is the ability to stand in a room full of monsters and make them believe you are the only human. You survive by being the silence between the gunshots. You survive by being the ghost that pulls the trigger and the loyal servant who wipes the blood from the floor. You never let them see your face. You never let them know your name. You just keep driving. The city lights blurred into long, yellow streaks against the windshield. The engine hummed a low, steady rhythm. I kept my eyes on the road. The night was cold. The night was mine.